Hi there, BookTube. It's Roz of Skyly Handling About the Books, and we're nearly halfway through August, and horror of horrors, I haven't done a roundup for July, the delights and disappointments of the month for me. The reason is because at the very end of July I was away for a little bit, and then catching up with work, and then I got a cold, and I wasn't horribly ill, but it was one of those very, very sneezy colds, you know, where you just uncontrollably sneeze at unexpected moments, and I just knew I couldn't possibly record anything because I'd just suddenly be melodramatically sneezing in the middle of it. But I'm fine now. So I finished 14 books in July, and I would be sad not to share some of those with you because I had some really enjoyable reading moments and books that I would love to talk to you about. And I'm going to start with the last thing that I read in the month of July, which I absolutely want to talk about and recommend to you if you haven't already read it. And that is C+nto and Other Poems by Joelle Taylor. Now, I said I was away towards the end of the month, and where I went was to WOMAD, which is a kind of international music festival. Happens in a few places around the world, but the one in the UK happens in Malmesbury in Wiltshire. Wonderful, lovely range of music, food, art, and also some spoken word, including a poetry stage. Well, I say stage, bit of grass, tent, that sort of thing. And I had the great good fortune to be able to see Joelle Taylor perform, and to perform what she was performing was quite significant chunks from this collection of poetry. And that gave me the opportunity to really appreciate her language. There's a kind of narrative thread through this collection, which becomes even clearer when you hear her talk about it and perform some of it. It is a very moving collection of poems, this, but also very what's the word I'm looking for? Accomplished. Yeah, Joelle Taylor is a bit of a kind of leading light of the performance poetry world. Her name was familiar to me from reading acknowledgements and thank yous to her in books by other poets that have come out of that world into publication. People like J. Barnard, for example. I'm always a little wary about poets that are known as performance poets because, sometimes they have this performing style that's a bit, I don't know, it's as if there's an idea of how you perform if you're a performance poet. She's just something else. She really is. So strong, so direct, and gives her whole self to her performance. So I would highly recommend this as a book to read, but I would also really suggest watching her perform some of it, which I was able to do live, but you can do on YouTube, of course, and I will make sure that I link to something below that is from this collection. It's I say there's a narrative thread, and it's sort of drawing on her experiences, her youth, and the sort of 1980s sort of lesbian and gay community in London, and in particular sort of butch lesbian sort of world that became her tribe, and some of the people that she knew. And she kind of creates characters in this collection that are based, they're not directly people she knew, but are kind of like amalgamations of real people, and they are beautiful and inspiring, and it's thrilling, exciting, and also at times quite sad. There we go. Now, I would describe this as my book of the month this month, and unusually for me, I've got it out of the way first, perhaps because it's poetry, and I know that people might not hang around for it if I did it at the end. My book of the month in June, I think, was The House of Doors by Tan Thuang Eng, and that, since I talked about it in June, it's now on the Booker Prize longlist, and I'm thrilled to see that. because I think it belongs there and I'd love to see it win. Now, that book, The House of Doors, was inspired by a book of short stories by the English writer William Somerset Maugham, who visited Malaysia and other countries in that area at the beginning of the 20th century and wrote stories based on the people that he met and so on. And that book is the Casuarina tree. And I read the story in June that it most directly inspired The House of Doors. But I enjoyed it so much that I thought, I've just got to read the rest of it. I'm not a big reader of short stories, you know that. But I really felt, no, I want to read the rest of this book. And I'm so glad I did. Maugham's style is very direct, relatively straightforward, unfussy, but very lucid. I think he's at times been underrated as a writer because he doesn't overcomplicate things. He just gets on and tells the story. He's a man of his time in terms of some of his language and so on, but he really nails the sort of British colonial society of the early 20th century in his stories. And they're full of drama and interesting characters. And definitely, I would if you read The House of Doors, do go and seek out the Casuarina tree and read the stories in that, because it will add something to your enjoyment. So, what else did I read? What else did I finish in July? I read two. Sorry, I'm conscious that there's something about the lighting in this room I don't normally record here, and I think I'm suddenly going dark and then going light again. Apologies for that. I'll try and hold a bit still, and then it won't happen. So, I read two comics or graphic works this month. I'm really trying to read each one a month, and I think I'd skipped one in May, so I read two. And they were both really good, actually. One was Genderqueer by Maia Kobabe, which is a book that I've been waiting for and talking about, looking forward to reading for ages, because my usually very reliable local library's ordering system somehow messed up on that one, and it took ages to come, but it finally did. And hurrah, because it's a really intense personal story of growing up, of Kobabe's sort of childhood and adolescence, and I don't know how they worked through, or I say there, but it should be air, because that's their preferred pronouns are air, and E, and how they kind of found themselves as a non-binary and asexual person. I love the graphic style of the book. I found that kind of balanced out what was perhaps a slightly earnest young American tone to the book. 100% a recommendation. And so, an interesting insight for me, not being either non-binary or ace, but also, a beautiful and rewarding read. The other comic I read was for my new country this month. So a country, where I've never read something by an author from the country before, and that was Costa Rica. And the book I read was Memories of Limon, and that's by Ido Brenes. And it's rather than autobiographical book like Genderqueer. This is more like family history. There's a main character in it in the present day who's kind of the author, although he obviously, perhaps to sort of protect family members, he says it's sort of fiction, but you can tell it's family memoir, really. I found it a little confusing to read at first, because you kind of he gets a set of photos, and then he draws those into the strips, as it were, but also him in the current day, and then also family members in the past, but not necessarily the same ones that are in the photos. It's all kind of a bit jumbled up, I suppose. He goes on a trip to Costa Rica and interviews sort of elderly relations, and of course, the book really grew on me, and I came to realize that kind of slightly disjointed quality and confusing quality is exactly what it's like trying to recreate and discover your family history through interviewing, getting reminiscences from older relatives. So yeah, a goodie. I'm going to get my 2 disappointments out of the way next, and neither of those these are relative rather than absolute disappointments, if that makes sense, because they were books where I just hoped for more. One of those was for my In Real Life book group, and that was The Mad Woman's Ball by Victoria Mass. It's translated by Frank Wynne. Top-rate translator, and not surprisingly it got a top-rate translator because it was a bestseller in France when it was published. Now, if you follow this channel, you will know that I like a short book. Short but strong, intense. That is almost that's perfect for me. This was one of those very rare books where I actually thought this book needed to be longer. It felt like plot lines and characters were slightly underdeveloped and had more potential. I've heard that, or know that, it was very quickly turned into a film in France, and I can see how that would work. And I suspect it may be a better film than it is a novel, and maybe the writer had half an eye to that as she was writing it. I don't know. It's there's a kind of ghosty spiritualism element to the story, which in a novel I found jarred a bit, because it was presented in too straightforward and realistic a way, rather than as, is this real, or is this someone's coincidence or imagining? It was too concrete in the novel, and in a film I think it might really work. You could do that differently. My other disappointment was a novella that I read for BookTube at War, which was a July reading event, and that was The Snow Goose by Paul Gallico. That was published in 1941. It is a very much loved classic of both nature writing and war writing, and I hope I won't upset anyone by saying that I found it disappointing. I found it disappointing because it was quite sentimental. Now, I guess if you're writing in 1941, you almost have a patriotic duty to write kind of uplifting things, don't you? And so that's fair enough for its time. But for me reading it, I mean, that was interesting, but didn't strike the right note for me, I suppose. The other thing is that there is really profound disableism in the book. Now, I should say that this is a really well-intentioned story. That isn't Gallico's sort of, he doesn't mean to be disablest, but it's a fundamental of the plot that being disabled makes you less likely to be lovable, to find love, to warrant that, and in a way that is, when you read it now, it's a bit like best bits though of the book were the bits where he's writing about waterfowl, wildfowl, like the goose and so on, and the scenes in Dunkirk, the war scenes, where the desperate evacuation of Allied soldiers from the beach at Dunkirk. My other BookTube at War choices were much more successful, I'm glad to say. One of those was Afterlives by Abdulrazak Gurnah. Now, Gurnah comes from Tanzania, but has lived most life in the UK, but he tends to set his books back in that part of East Africa. And this book is sort of set in and around the time of World War One. And I think that one of Gurnah's interests, I suppose, is reminding people that that war absolutely happened in the British and German possessions in Africa as well as in Europe. It's kind of like a forgotten side of the war, I suppose. And I loved it. Excellent book. I buddy read that with Sean the Book Maniac and Tilly of Tilly Shelf, and Sean is going to do a one of his recorded chats about it eventually. So I will say no more about that one. The other that I read was Wandering Souls by Cecile Pin or Pan. She's half Vietnamese, half French, so I'm guessing it's Pan. I don't know. I tried to check, but I couldn't. I only found people saying Pin. But anyway, this is about a book that kind of starts in the aftermath of the war in Vietnam. And it's based on her mother's experience of being one of the Vietnamese boat people. So that's people that escaped Vietnam in small boats and wound up in Thailand or China in sort of refugee camps, and then get resettled into other countries, including the UK and France and America. And her mother ends up in France, but she chooses to write it about a sort of fictional family that wind up in the UK instead. And this is a heartbreaking book. Okay, I'm going to warn you. It's not perfect, but as a debut, it is brilliant, and it has some really important things to say about migration and resettlement and identity and grief and loss and sort of how children deal with I don't want to do any spoilers, but how they deal with that and pull through or not. What impact that trauma has on your life. It also it follows them sort of from the 1970s up to the present day, and at the end of the book we're getting the beginning of the COVID pandemic and the sort of upsurge of anti-Asian racism that happened at the beginning of COVID, which I kind of had like almost forgotten, but it was a very real thing, I know, and it was really interesting to have that sort of drawn into the end of the book. I suppose the main character in this book is roughly my age or slightly older. The UK parts are a Britain that I was also living in, and yet how different my experience was from that of the young people in the book. Yeah, well worth reading. Now, another of the events that I took part in this month was the Women's World Cup Readathon, and that was sort of began at the end of July and is still carrying on now in August. Wonderful fun, and thank you to my co-hosts, Mark and Jack and Alice, and all the participants. Now, what we do in that readathon is we're allocated a team, a country, and my initial team was Portugal, but I chose to try and read something from all the countries that were in the group that Portugal was in the tournament, so, or at least linked to those countries. So Wandering Souls was my book for Vietnam. She wasn't born there. Mother was, but she's half Vietnamese, and it was very much about the sort of Vietnamese experience. Another of the teams was the USA, and obviously Kobabe Maia, US author, so is Paul Gallico, so that one was covered. For the Netherlands, I read a short story by a early 20th century Dutch writer called Nescio. That was a pen name. His real name was Jan Hendrik Frederik Grunlo. You can see why he had a pen name with a name like that. And it's called The Freeloader. It was published in 1911. This is a really modern translation by Damion Searls, another translator I really rate. It's odd, it's funny, it's sad. It's kind of about why a kind of educated young man from a good family might choose to more or less freeload off his friends and acquaintances, and why they might put up with that, what they might get in return. Yeah, lovely. Almost a novella rather than a short story. It's kind of long end of a short story or short end of a novella. But for Portugal, which was my initial, main country, I wanted to read a whole novel, and I read The Migrant Painter of Birds by Lidia Jorge. Jorge, I think that's how you pronounce it in Portuguese. Yeah, apologies, Portuguese speakers, if I've got that rather wrong. Written in originally 1998. This is a translation by Margaret Costa, another top translator. It's another odd book, slightly disconcerting thing to read. It's the story of a family in the south of Portugal, where the author comes from. So just inland from the Algarve, what's now sort of big holiday area, but set between the 1950s and the 1970s, and it's about a kind of a patriarch of a family trying to grow his family farm and keep all his children, his sons and sons-in-law working on the farm, and how that kind of falls apart over time. So it's really talking about, migration and diaspora, but also family relationships and so on. And we see it all through the eyes of his granddaughter, and we follow her from sort of childhood to adulthood. Now, Jorge is one of the most respected sort of modern, late 20th century, early 21st century women writers, authors in Portugal. She has a reputation for being a bit impenetrable, I think, not being perhaps an easy read. It is what you describe as a recursive novel, in that you get a kind of a key incident, and then time moves on, but people keep the story keeps coming back to that incident and sort of filling out more detail and giving you a bigger picture. I didn't find it an easy read, but I did find it a rewarding one. And it really speaks to that. Yeah, the Portuguese diaspora of the sort of second half of the 20th century, and the impact of modernization in Portugal, and what was a very sort of agricultural economy changing. Yeah. So yeah, not easy but rewarding is how I would also describe the EM Forster that I read this month. Now, Jen the Librarian has embroiled me and a bunch of other readers in her year-long read through of all of Forster's novels in publication order. And in July we reached 1910 and Howard's End. And Howard's End is famous for his being the book that really explores his philosophy, Only Connect. It's a magnificent novel, and I don't think I need to say more about it. So that brings me to what in many ways is the main event of July for me, which is Jane Austen July. But I think the things I read for that are probably, not things that I would talk about as much in this video, because I made a few videos in the course of the month with Tilly, my daughter, and they're either on my channel or hers, Tilly's Shelf. So I kind of explored a lot of these things already, I suppose. But I will just quickly say, so I read another chunk of Austen's Juvenilia, volume 2. The Juvenilia is interesting, but I don't want to read all of it all in one go. Like one volume is which is short. It's all short stuff is enough. I read some more of her letters. Again, I wouldn't read the whole book of letters in one go. That wouldn't be a pleasure. But gradually work my way through them is very enjoyable. So, and then I read 3 actual books. One, an Austen, of course, and I reread Pride and Prejudice for the umpteenth time. Never goes stale for me. I think rereading it really reminds me of how perfectly constructed Pride and Prejudice is as a novel, and also the quite extraordinary way Austen uses dialogue to introduce and explore characters and their relationships and move the plot forward in interesting ways. Magic. I think that, that magic is part of why I always struggle a bit with the Jane Austen July prompt to read a Jane Austen retelling. And, because they can't match up, I don't, so I'm trying now to avoid books that are really kind of going over ground from her novels. And instead, this time I read Godmersham Park by Jill Hornby, which is kind of like historical fiction that's sort of Jane Austen adjacent and related and links to her life, because Godmersham Park was the house where her Austen's brother, which one? Edward lived, and he was the lucky one that was adopted by rich cousins, and so the novel is set there, and the central figure is Anne Sharp, who really was the governess for James's children for a period, and became Jane Austen's, good friend, and remained a lifelong friend, even though they didn't see each other frequently. They exchanged letters. They were important to each other, and Hornby sort of starts from that and builds a story around it that worked well, and I enjoyed it. You really feel her respect and affection for Jane Austen in the novel, and she depicts her quite effectively, I think, and it's very obvious that she's read biographies and read all the letters, and really draws on that in writing Godmersham Park, as she did in her previous book, Miss Austen, that's sort of seeing Jane through the eyes of her sister Cassandra, and creating a sort of writing about possible sort of history and future for Cassandra, and building on the known facts. It's clear to me that Hornby has definitely read the third book that I read for Jane Austen July, which was Claire Tomalin's biography, Jane Austen: A Life. Now, Tomalin's biography, it's solid, it's thorough, it's detailed, it does its job, and I'm very glad to have read it. It didn't sparkle for me like some of the other non-fiction that I've read sort of about Jane Austen, her life or her writing and so on, but what it did do is, I think I'm going to find it much easier and more rewarding reading the letters now, because I will no longer be totally befuddled by which James or which Edward or which Eliza, or which is this, a cousin or a friend, or I've got it all sorted now. So fingers crossed, future Jane Austen Julys, it will pay off, having read the Tomalin. So that was my month, a really enjoyable month with all sorts of, as I say, delights and discoveries. I would say my number one discovery and number one delight was C+nto, but so many other riches. How was your July? Do you still remember it? You're buried in August by now, but I would still love to hear.